Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hi, this is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine. Today's topic, Solve the Procrastination Puzzle, will put us on the road to completing daily tasks and working toward our goals. We've all said to ourselves many times, I'll do that later when I'm not quite so overwhelmed or when I'm feeling a little better about myself. A lot of readers, in fact, write into Attitude saying, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I still don't do it. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Tim Pychyl, an associate professor of psychology at Carleton University in Ottawa. He is the author of Solving the Procrastination Puzzle, a concise guide to strategies for change. In fact, you can read all of Tim's writings on the website www.procrastination.ca. Tim is a recognized authority on the subject of procrastination. Welcome, Tim, and good to have you here with us.
Thanks very much, Wayne. I'm happy to join you. I want to start with a common misperception, Wayne, and everyone on that's listening. Welcome to everyone. It's interesting to talk to so many people. But procrastination is not a time management problem per se. And so often people, well-meaning friends will say, oh, you need to get a daily planner or you need to organize your time better. And planning is necessary but far from sufficient, even from the kind of things Wayne was saying a moment ago. We know what we ought to do and we should do, and we don't step up and do it. So the key thing here is that it's about self-regulation failure, because what we're doing with procrastination is we're coping with our emotions at the time. Usually some sort of frustration or just that general feeling of, I don't feel like it, I don't want to. In a sense, we have a little 6-year-old alive and well in us we know what children can be like. It's time to make your bed. I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I didn't ask you what you wanted to do or what you feel like. It's time to make your bed. And of course, that's what we play out in our own lives. And somehow, just like the 6-year-old, we think that's a good enough reason to not do what we intend to do. Now, it doesn't mean that planning and organization and structure isn't important, and we're going to come back to that. It's helpful. But I think at its heart, what we really have to understand is that procrastination isn't a breakdown in our time management necessarily. It's that we're coping with our emotions by using avoidance. And of course, whenever we use a coping strategy and it's successful, it gets rewarded and it becomes a habit. So it becomes a problem unto itself. And these habits start very young in life. I can remember the very first time I remember some academic procrastination was back in grade 5. And I don't know what reason I didn't want to do the task at hand, but school is a very unnatural act at the best of times. Even though I've done lots of education since that time, I certainly struggled back then with what this assignment meant and whether I was going to do it. But unfortunately, it ended in an oral presentation, and I was just naked in front of the class with this oral presentation. And I had done all this avoidance, and of course, we use avoidance in lots of ways, and oftentimes in school, and it becomes a habit. So I wanted to start there by saying that it's not necessarily a time management thing. It has a lot to do with emotional management, and we'll come back to what that means as well. And as well, it starts early in life for many of us. This is an important saying that at the next bullet point, all procrastination is delay, but not all delay is procrastination. And I think it's particularly important when we're considering attention deficit, because a lot of people beat themselves up with procrastination, and I have to be honest with you, I'm not always convinced it's really procrastination. And to explain that, I have to go to my next point. Procrastination is a voluntary delay. That means at some level I'm choosing to delay. Now, a lot of us will feel like we have no choice. We're feeling compelled to avoid, and we may want to talk about that in questions, but ultimately we are making the choice. It's not like someone's holding a gun to my head and saying, don't do it, or I have a much more pressing task at hand. For example, if right now the children's school called and said, one of your children is sick, I might have to say, gee, I'm sorry, Wayne, but I can't continue right now because I have a larger priority that I can't do anything about. And no one would say I was procrastinating at that point. So procrastination is a voluntary delay of an intended act. It means I had to decide I was going to do this, and I usually have decided to do it because it's in my best interest at that time. But I'm aware that this needless delay will probably come at a cost, so that I'm aware that For example, if I was just decided right now, I don't really feel like doing this right now. Wayne, let's do this another time. That would be a needless delay that would be quite irrational, and the cost would be my relationship with all of you. You'd think, what a flake this guy is. Like, what's wrong with him? So the discrepancy here, or the difference here, is really important. We all delay every day. We have to use delay as we prioritize things. Some things have to wait while we do other things, and that's very dynamic. We can have a really good plan, but as the day unfolds, some things will have to give because you think, oh, this is taking longer than I thought, or this has just emerged and it's more important. And that's very rational. But there's something that's rationally criticizable or even irrational about procrastination. You know you're making the wrong choice. Now let me go back to the first comment I made with this slide, which is there's not very much research that relates ADHD or ADD to procrastination specifically, and I can talk about some of that later. But most of them talk about the fact that ADHD is related to procrastination. And I'm not always convinced. I'm sure it's related to delay, but for example, if what's happening is that you're unable to remember what you're going to do, or your inattention has taken you far away from the task at hand, now what's happened is it's not really a voluntary delay, if you see what I mean, that you're not saying, oh, I don't feel like this, and giving in to feel good and putting the task off as a coping mechanism. You really just can't remember anymore. So it'll be interesting to discuss some of this, because I think there's a distinction that will be important in terms of how you try to change the needless delay in your life. Now, it's still needless delay, but on the one hand, it carries that real negative connotation of procrastination, which is, yeah, I voluntarily decided to do this, as opposed to, I don't know what's wrong with you sometimes. I just forget things. I mentioned this in passing already. There's very limited published research about procrastination and ADHD or ADD. The most recent paper was published in 2014 in the International Journal of Methods in Psychiatric Research, and the various journals that these come out in are really wide-ranging. And typically, all journal articles report that there's certainly a relation between procrastination and ADHD, in the sense that, and I quote one of my colleagues from the University of DePaul University in Chicago, Joe Ferrari. He published a paper in 2006 on this, and he summarized it by saying, people diagnosed with ADHD are characterized as having difficulties completing tasks on time, organizing work, and are often described as being careless, impulsive, distracted, and forgetful. And they also report feeling easily stressed, impatient, and short-tempered. So these are characteristics of ADHD as described by the American Psychological Association, as described by Ferrari in his article. And of course, we see a correlation between self-report measures of procrastination and diagnoses of ADHD. Notwithstanding all of that, I do challenge the notion of distinguishing between when we're actually procrastinating, which I think can happen with ADHD, and when we are having a needless delay that is a result of inattention and difficulty organizing things. And I think we need to talk about that some more. When I was training to be a teacher, I've done quite a few different degrees over time, and I've ended up with this Ph.D. in psychology and stayed at a university. But I trained to work in a public school as well and to teach children. And I remember when we were doing workshops with experts on special needs children who had exceptionalities of various sorts. And the kind of strategies that were being suggested to us as educators seemed to me to be strategies that everyone would use. And so I challenged the presenter at one of these workshops. I said, aren't these strategies anyone could benefit from? And of course the answer was absolutely, but anyone with a, quote, special need needs to focus on these, or needs to have the educator focus on these much more explicitly. So there's a big message in here in terms of the kind of things in writing that I do that talks about procrastination for anyone, and then procrastination in the case of things that might be specific to having attention deficit problems. So the strategies that anyone can use and benefit from in terms of managing task engagement and staying on task and facilitating focus are essential for anyone who is chronically challenged with inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. In fact, the last paper that I mentioned published in 2014, showed that only inattention was correlated with procrastination in their study. And that's not the case of other studies where we see both impulsivity and inattention correlated with procrastination. But of course, there's these variables in terms of psychology. If we measure someone's impulsivity or their inattention, it's a continuous variable. And so we all lie somewhere along that spectrum. And at some point, we may diagnose someone as that there's so much inattention and so much impulsivity that we'll consider it a problem per se, but that someone just on the other side of that cutoff point or that line would not necessarily be diagnosed. But they'd still have an issue with impulsivity or inattention. And of course, we find in our regular studies with procrastination that impulsivity is very highly correlated with procrastination. I have talked about this first point. Stuart jumped by there probably because he saw that impulsivity is a personality trait that is related to higher levels of procrastination. But what I didn't talk about is that there are other personality traits as well. Personality psychologists take a perspective on traits, these stable individual differences, in such a way that if we take the very highest order traits, we call them super traits, much like the primary colors, where we can take 3 basic colors and make any other color from it. In personality psychology, it's argued that we can take the 5 major personality traits and basically produce any blend of person that we see. Of the 5, one of them is conscientiousness. Now, each of these traits is highly heritable as well, so that any one of the traits that I might pick on, and I'm picking on one of them, conscientiousness, 50% of the variability we see in this trait in individuals is due to the variability we also see in the genotype. So we inherit some of this from our parents, and of course we learn some of it as well. But someone who's very conscientious is organized, not playful. That's actually an interesting typo there. Planful, organized, planful, and dutiful. And right there you can see that it's the antithesis of procrastination, and that's exactly what we find, that people high in conscientiousness are actually low in procrastination. And I mention this because there's more than one personality trait alive and well in any of us. So although we might be very impulsive or having problems with attention, at the same time we may be very conscientious. So there's other aspects of our being that comes into play when in terms of a resilience resource towards not procrastinating. And this dutifulness to others or to self, being organized and planful, are all assets in terms of procrastinating less. I think most people that have tuned into the webinar today are keen to understand not only the relation between procrastination and ADHD, and in fact, in some ways, Wayne's opening remarks made it clear that lots of people recognize it day to day that I struggle with procrastination. But that's true of just about everyone I meet. In fact, it's kind of an interesting thing to be first a psychologist. So if I go to a social event and someone says, "What do you do?" and I'll say, "I'm a psychologist." And they say, "Oh, are you analyzing me now?" And I'll say, "Yeah, I've already finished that. You're kind of worried about what other people think." And then from there, it might be, "So what do you study?" And I say, "I'll study procrastination." And that's, "Oh, my goodness, you should study me. I'd be your best case, or better yet, you can study my husband." But in any case, as much as we do see a relation between attention deficit or ADHD and procrastination is a common frailty for being human, about not following through on our intentions. So the strategies that we have, as I've already noted, are important for everyone, whether or not they have ADHD or any other thing that makes life a challenge in terms of staying on task. So I want to go back to the planning is necessary but not sufficient. And one of the places to start with our plans is not to make general overall goal intentions. So broad goal intentions, for example, I'll do that on the weekend, when you don't specify what that is or when the weekend begins and ends. Does the weekend begin Friday at 6 o'clock or Saturday morning when I wake up, whenever that might be? And when does it exactly end? Does it end Sunday at midnight, or does it go into the wee hours of Monday? See, everything about it is vague and poorly defined. And of course, then there's no accountability. And in a sense, there's no pressure to live up to any sort of plan. One of the things I've learned from philosophers recently in terms of the philosophy of action is that when we make an intention, that partial plan comes with some pressure for means, ends, coherence. In other words, we feel some pressure to coherently follow through, to fill out our partial plans and act. But if I make a very vague, weak goal intention, then I don't feel I have to live up to anything. I don't have to fill in the plans the same way. So it's important for those of us who struggle with our own inability to follow through to start specifying our plans more. Now, like anything, it's a double-edged sword. We can over-specify early, and that has its own downfalls, and we might talk about that. But for most of us, we benefit from making more if-then or when-then sorts of intentions. When I'm finished with the webinar today, then I'm going to finish the paperwork that I'm doing for a colleague's job. I'm the director of a department. We're doing a retirement replacement. I have other tasks going on today. So if I really want to make sure that I do this, I don't just say, oh yes, I have to finish that job work sometime today. I know that the moment that Wayne and Stuart and I say goodbye, I'm going to shut off my microphone and go to that paperwork. When this is done, then that. And what psychologists, particularly a fellow named Peter Gallwitzer, has shown is that when we make a cue for action that's out in the environment, when this webinar is over, then that cue in the environment kind of frees me up cognitively. I don't have to remember it so much. I've made a cue for my action, and then I'm more likely to follow through. So as a very first step to becoming more effective at the planning stage of things, remembering that planning is necessary but not sufficient, and I'm going to come back to that because this is huge, but it really is helpful to say when, then, or if, then. And you'll find that those specific environmental cues help a great deal. The other thing about these implementation intentions, as they're called, these specific when, then, or if, thens, is that you want to make things as concrete as possible. I wouldn't necessarily just say that when the webinar is over, then I'll get on to that job-related stuff. I would want to say, then I'm going to do the retirement replacement justification form, because that's exactly what I have to do. I get very concrete about it. Because interestingly, and through psychological research, we've learned that when we think of things concretely, they seem to belong more to the present. And when we think about things abstractly, there's not that pressure. They seem to belong more to the future. So if I want to develop a sense of urgency around things, not only will I plan using when, then, these implementation intentions, how I'm going to implement things, but I'll make them as concrete as possible, specifying what I'm going to do, because then there's this sense of it belongs to today. It's a unique thing about the way we think, but as the behavioral economists have shown us, we are predictably irrational in many ways. You know, it seems kind of strange that just thinking about things concretely would make them seem more time urgent, but they do. There's lots more I'd like to say, and I'm hoping it's going to come out in our questions. But I want to talk about the fact that we did a study a while ago where we looked at self-forgiveness and procrastination. And I did this with a colleague who studied a fair bit on forgiveness, not necessarily self-forgiveness. And my expectations was that it would be forgive and forget. If I forgive myself for procrastinating, I'll just do it some more. Lo and behold, when we conducted the study, what we found was, and we did this on students because students are this wonderful captive audience for academics, that is, but I think you'll see something in the human condition that's very important here, that students who were preparing for an exam and procrastinated a great deal but forgave themselves, they actually procrastinated less in preparation for the second exam. So I said to my colleague Michael Wall, this is my colleague I did the research with, Michael, I don't get it. How do you make sense of it? Michael said, Tim, imagine that you and Wayne had offended each other. What would be the motivation? Well, Wayne and I would avoid each other. Exactly. He said, well, that transgression against Wayne, if you think about it with procrastination, it's actually a transgression against the self. So when you transgress against the self with procrastination, what's the motivation? Well, you want to avoid the whole thing. I don't want to think about it. But what if Wayne offered some forgiveness to you? What would be the motivation? I'd approach Wayne again. Wayne would approach me. And if you offers yourself some self-forgiveness around your procrastination, the same thing, the motivation changes. This is a whole avenue of research now on self-compassion and procrastination, and it comes down to that old adage of, you know, in life it's always lived 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And if we're really a harsh internal critic, we're only feeding some very bad internal dialogue that's usually alive and well for most of us anyhow. And we have to be firm in terms of our resolve to make change, but gentle with ourselves in terms of that compassion that, yeah, it's human to err, and I'm going to get up and try again. And where the mindfulness comes in, of course, is that, when I said that planning is necessary but not sufficient, well, let's say I make this really good when-then intention. So when the webinar is over, then I'm going to work on the retirement replacement justification. And then this ends, and I think, I don't feel like it. This is a tough one. I just don't want to do it. And this is what we all have to recognize, that just because we make plans and we make them as specific as possible and we put the environmental cue there, it doesn't mean that when the time comes, we're actually going to feel like it. And the mindfulness not only brings some self-compassion, but mindfulness also brings a non-judgmental awareness of our emotions. This is hugely important. I think it's very similar to the day that you learn that you're eating sometimes, not because you're hungry, but because you're trying to cope with some emotions. Or you're spending money in a store, not because you need that thing, that new pair of shoes, but because you're doing what my sister jokes is called retail therapy, right? And in each case, we're doing something similar. Sometimes we're eating calories we can't afford. Sometimes we're spending money we can't afford. And with procrastination, we're wasting time that we can't afford to waste. And the common theme there is where I began, which is it's an emotion-focused coping strategy. So the mindfulness that I'm speaking of not only builds this self-compassion, but the non-judgmental awareness of my emotions. And so I learned that I can have an emotion without being that emotion. Yes, I feel, as Wayne's opening comments or quote was, I feel overwhelmed. And so you can say, you might want to try to justify to yourself, I'll come back to this when I don't feel so overwhelmed. Well, or you can take a non-judgmental stance to your overwhelmedness and say, isn't it amazing how overwhelmed I feel right now? I can have this emotion. I need not be this emotion. I get this quote from a fellow named Parker Palmer. He wrote a wonderful book called The Courage to Teach, and teaching is my passion. And this book in particular is one that I've taught many of my students and shared with colleagues, because the quote continues, and he said, I may have fear, but I need not be my fear, for I can work from some other part of my inner landscape. And we all have other parts of our inner landscape. And that's what I have to be non-judgmentally aware of. Yeah, right now I'm having this feeling of fear or feeling out of control. But there's other parts of me that I can draw on. And if I'm just patient here, these other emotions will pass and I'll be able to function. And really, to me, that's getting at the heart of the strategy I use every day. And I have to use it every day, because if I didn't, I would procrastinate. And I always say to myself, let's just get started. So this let's just get started is the real turning point in my life and what I've gained from so much research. In fact, I'll close my opening comments by saying that I do a blog for Psychology Today, and I've been doing it for years. And I had written about ADHD and procrastination on the little bit of research that was there. And I've gotten lots of reader comments, and one reader wrote so eloquently about his experience or her experience of procrastination and ADHD. And at the end of this, and you can read it on Psychology Today if you want, it's called the Don't Delay blog. But this is a quote from the letter that he wrote to me, or she wrote to me. The best advice I gleaned from your blog is a basic truth understood by anyone who succeeds. To accomplish anything, you'll have to do what needs to be done, whether you feel like it or not. For a chronic procrastinator, that's a bitter pill to swallow. But I found that the more I embrace this hard fact of life and put it into practice, the less I allow my anxiety, frustration, and craving for immediate mood fixes to dictate my actions in the moment. And I thought, wow, if you're getting that from the blog, then I'm really succeeding, because we have that 6-year-old alive and well of us who doesn't want to deal with frustration, who doesn't feel like it. And rather than giving in to feel good, we can pull up a lot of these strategies, and I think we'll talk about them more in a moment, and just get started. So, Wayne, I'll leave it there and invite questions.
Ron has a question. He says, I'm in job search mode at this time, and it's really critical that I get moving on it. I know all the platitudes, just start, break items into small tasks, etc., etc. Nevertheless, I still can't get motivated. Any suggestions?
Well, you've picked a tough one to start with. It's not surprising you can't get motivated, and the emotions are huge there. Job loss involves a process of grief often, and a lot of mixed emotions around change. Sometimes it can be a welcome change. I lost my job as a teacher back in 1992. It did open the door eventually for the role that I have today, but at the time I struggled. It's difficult to get off the couch and do something. And you're right, they sound like platitudes about just breaking it down, but we do have to bootstrap ourselves. We know from psychological research that even a little bit of progress on a goal fuels our well-being, which of course feeds our motivation. So you do have to find that way to prime the pump, just to pick something that you're going to do. So I'm going to argue you're going to have to put a lot of strategies together in a row, which is often the case. There's no magic bullet here, but that first, you're going to make a specific plan. You're going to say, and I would be surprised if this isn't the case, that your CV is not in a form that's going to be useful to you, so it might be the first thing you need to tackle. Now, that can feel huge, because how am I going to revise this thing? So the very first thing is to set that implementation intention, that if-then, just like when I finished the webinar intention, and then make it very specific. All you're going to do is update your contact information. I'm not talking about rewriting your whole CV. I'm going to open the document on my computer and update my contact information. And when that time comes, you know you're not going to feel like it. So then you're going to make the next deal with yourself is that I'm just going to get started. That's all I'm going to do. And I don't have to do any more than that. If 5 minutes from now I don't want to do any more, I'm going to stop. I always have that license to stop. And honestly, there are no other ways around that to bootstrap our agency. Other than someone literally dragging us, and that's not our agency. So it sounds like platitudes on the one hand, but it's truly the way we can bootstrap ourselves to these little wins. I'll give you another concrete example. I really like to take the stairs when I'm at work, and I also like to ride my exercise bicycle. I work on the 15th floor of one building and the 8th floor of another, and I go between them all day long. And of course, I get to the bottom of the building, and I think, oh, the stairs. Now, I want to, in the broader sense, take the stairs because it's so good for me. I feel so good when I get to the top. But when I'm at the bottom, I don't feel like it. So I just say to myself, I'll just take the first flight. And if I don't want to take after the first flight, I can get the elevator there just as easily as I get the elevator here. 99% of the time, of course, I walk to the 15th and I feel great. But it's that moment, that real lived experience we all have of that moment where you're ready to just stay on the couch and not do anything or not take the stairs, that you have to say, I'm just going to get started. I'm just going to do this little bit. And if I don't want to do it after that, I don't have to. I'm sorry if it sounds like a platitude. I know in my own life it's far from a platitude. It's a specific strategy. Yeah. And really, that motivational issue is huge because sometimes what we can do is find external motivation for a while. So we enlisted other people to put pressure on us. But honestly, sometimes in our lives, that's been the whole problem. We've had authoritarian parents running our lives for us like that. We've had bosses that externalize everything. In fact, we've never learned to self-regulate. And so the self-regulation has to be bootstrapped from a place of, gee, I have to struggle with my own sense of agency. I have to struggle with the fact that I am making choices. If I'm sitting here on the couch, I have to acknowledge I'm choosing to sit here. And I can choose to get up. And that's why, at its heart, I think procrastination is a deeply existential issue, because it's not about being productive at the workplace. It's about living the life you want. And so it's acknowledging that this is my life. This is not a dress rehearsal. I'm making a choice right now. I'm never getting this moment back. In fact, that's why I think that we see in every major world religion the notion of sloth is connected with the notion of sin and whatever that means in the various world religions. But there's not a world religion that doesn't have this notion of sloth being a problem of the human condition, because we're wasting the one resource in our life that's non-renewable, and that's time. And I think sometimes when you can be so stark in your question about, how am I going to find that motivation, I think it's that time when we have to dig down into those existential moments and realize, this is my life I'm talking about. Like, I can lay here and wallow in it if I choose to, but at least I have to recognize that I'm actually choosing to do this. And at that point, sometimes it just sobers us right up.
Mm-hmm. Teresa has a question. Actually, there are several questions like this. I am fraught with guilt and shame when I procrastinate. I feel that way anytime I have things that need to be done and I'm not doing them. I have a very hard time shifting gears and taking a break. Do you have any tips for dealing with this shame?
Oh, it is huge. In fact, I had a beautiful quote. There's been some research done on types of perfectionism and procrastination. And there's more than one flavor of perfectionism. There's a self-oriented perfectionist, and it's seen to be an adaptive perfectionism in the sense that self-oriented perfectionists derive a sense of pleasure from their labors and efforts. They set high standards internally. These are their standards. Socially prescribed perfectionists, on the other hand, they're always trying to live up to the expectation of others. They have this internal dialogue going on that's really quite negative. In fact, the socially prescribed perfectionists in this case, their motivation emerges from an internal desire to avoid fear, because of fear of failure, and to avoid embarrassment, and to avoid the shame and guilt that Therese is speaking of. So, again, this is a common experience for many of us as human beings. It's not just the socially prescribed perfectionists. Many of us feel that shame and guilt, and we're motivated more by avoidance of that than we are approaching success. And acknowledging that internal dialogue is the place to start. And in some of my speaking points already, I have spoken to what is ultimately the answer there, which is some self-compassion. And also this, I can have this emotion without being this emotion. At some point, it may require the support of a counseling relationship, because these internal dialogues, they loom large with many of us. And they, at their heart, a rational emotive behavior therapist would help us see that there is something quite irrational about the kind of things I'm saying to myself. And where are these coming from? And is any of this true? And just so that you understand that I'm speaking from this in a personal way as much as I am as a researcher, I can experience success day after day. And yet I can end the day looking at my schedule tomorrow and feel overwhelmed and think, I am so going to screw up tomorrow. Tomorrow the wheels are coming off my life. And I can start to perseverate on that and to ruminate on that. And the only way I can have some ownership of my life again is to shut off that voice. Now, shutting off that voice sometimes requires a counseling relationship, but sometimes it requires just an awareness that we're working on together today of that is the issue. The issue is that I'm having emotions that I'm fueling so that I become the emotion, that I'm having thoughts that I'm not just being non-judgmentally aware of. I'm taking them as like, this is truth. If you wrote down, or if I wrote down everything that I thought in a day, someone would have me committed, right? That I have thoughts that range from the homicidal through the suicidal to the inane, and our thoughts, our minds are busy places. The Buddhists called it like a monkey mind. And when you try to do any mindfulness meditation, you run face first into that. And so I really hear you, Teresa, when you say that you feel the weight of the shame and guilt and the knowing what I ought to do and I'm not doing. But the place to start is with acknowledging that these are my thoughts, and I don't have to ruminate on them. I can let them pass. I can go, isn't it interesting that I have this strong emotion about this? Isn't it interesting that I have these thoughts? But they don't own me. They are just thoughts. They are just emotions, which are quite fleeting. And sometimes it's sad that emotions are fleeting, because when I have the emotion of joy or happiness, for example, I wish I could just bottle it and hang on to it. And yet some of us don't learn how to kind of maintain that beautiful emotion, but we've become expert at how to ruminate on the worst emotions in our lives. And in lots of ways, that's why positive psychology has become such a mainstream in psychology now, as we try to learn how to cultivate the better things in our lives, because we seem so good at cultivating the things that bring us down. Again, a partial answer, I'm sure, Teresa, but I think I've cut to the heart of it in terms of acknowledging that these are irrational internalizations that we've developed over time, often through the influence of significant others in our lives, but we don't have to perpetuate them.
Mm-hmm. There's another question about cognitive behavioral therapy. Does that help, or can that help with procrastination?
Absolutely. In fact, I have some colleagues who only would think that helps. We published Gordon Flett. He's a Canada Research Chair at York University and an expert on perfectionism, in fact. He and I co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy back in 2012. The editor there is Wendy Dryden, and he's a rational emotive behavior therapist, a cognitive behavior therapist, and there's a whole school of thought there that that's really the way to get at procrastination because, as I was just saying in answer to Teresa's question, it is learning how to deal with these negative thoughts that are stimulated when we face some task at hand that brings out these deep feelings of ought and shame and guilt, and then learning how to shut those off so that we can get on with other behaviors. So if you have the chance to engage in that sort of therapy, I think I'd highly recommend it.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to this one. Jennifer asks a question. An ongoing problem I deal with is when planning a project. I am highly motivated to get started, and I buy supplies, make preparations, and then never start the project. It's as if all the joy is in the planning. Then my motivation leaves me. She wants to know why she does this, and I guess any kind of strategy you can help her with to overcome it.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think many of us can relate to it, and the answer is kind of surprising. Back in the 1990s, Alan Blunt, he's now an instructor at my university, did a study with me as part of his graduate work where we looked at what makes a task aversive, because we'd all argue that, gee, we avoid aversive things in our lives, things we find unpleasant, but we wanted to know what are the underlying psychological characteristics of it. For some people, it's returning phone calls. For someone else, it's doing something else. We all have our favorite tasks to avoid. So he looked at people's projects over time, and he looked at what dimensions make something aversive. But he added what's so important in the consideration of procrastination, this notion of a temporal dimension, time dimension. And so just as the question revealed, there's an early phase of a project where it's the inception stage and the planning stage, and then there's the action stage, and they are different. And how we found them to be different in this study was this, that in the early stages of a project with inception and planning, what makes something aversive is a lack of meaning. So whether it's enjoyable and whether you have a passion for it. And so it sounds like those projects have meaning for you, and so therefore you don't procrastinate. You're quite engaged. You feel that you're ready to get going on it. Interestingly, when we got to and I will add one more thing, that no matter what, any task that was boring, frustrating, or difficult was considered aversive across the board. So meaning didn't have a lot to do with that, but any task that was boring, difficult, or frustrating was always seen as aversive. But where we find these distinctions play out is with other tasks that you wouldn't necessarily think that about. But in the early phases of a project, if a project was meaningful, it wasn't aversive. Now, we get to the action phase. Meaning isn't the main player anymore. It's structure. It's how to do it. And if you're uncertain about how to proceed, that's what fuels the procrastination. So the question you have to ask yourself when you get to the action phase and you feel like you're immobilized is it because I don't know what to do? Do I not know what the next step is? And in fact, that's why I even began to study procrastination, Wayne. I actually did my Ph.D. on goal pursuit. I was studying people's personal projects and how affected their well-being. And in one of the studies I did, I interviewed people. And I remember talking to one doctoral student, and I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Nothing. I'm really procrastinating." "So what should you be doing?" "I should be working on my comprehensive exam." "Oh, so why aren't you doing that?" "Well, I really don't know what to do. I don't even really know what a comprehensive exam is." I said, "Why don't you ask your advisor?" "Oh, I couldn't do that. I don't want him to know that I'm not doing anything." Well, you can see the double bind you're putting yourself in there, and it kind of played out when we did this other research study that showed that at the action stage, the thing you have to solve is the structure. Do you know how to structure it? And if you actually do know what the next steps are, then you have to pull out other strategies particularly around, now I don't feel like it. Because the other thing about the beginning of a project versus the action stage is that the beginning holds so much promise. the ideas dance in your head. But we all know that ideas are different than writing. When we start to write, some of the things we thought made so much sense fall down. Or if we're actually, like say we're actually building something or we're designing something, in our mind, the loosely held ideas are so elegant. But then when we actually start working with materials, it's not anything like we imagined. And that's when we face the frustration, the anxiety, the self-doubt. So sometimes those emotions only come out when the rubber hits the road of really doing things. And at that point, then, not only do we have to know that we structure it well and know what to do, but we have to be ready to deal with that. I don't want to. I don't feel like it. I'm overwhelmed. I'm afraid. And it goes back to a lot of that fact that this is an emotional intelligence we have to draw on at that point.
Mm-hmm. This is a mother talking about her 7-year-old son. I mean, we've mostly been dealing with adults, but he seems to procrastinate a lot, and it's difficult to get him going on homework or cleaning his room. You recommend rewards. How do I help him to get going? So I guess the strategies are a bit different for a middle school child.
Yeah, and kids are a work in progress. Partly because if we were to get into the neurophysiology of self-control, we would talk about executive function. We'd talk about the prefrontal cortex, the last part of our brain as a species that was added that does the organization and planning. And that's the last part of our brain at the individual level to develop. So there's developmental issues with children in self-control. And, there's very many, famous studies, including Walter Mischel's The Marshmallow Study that talks about individual differences in the ability to delay gratification. But I'm a 59-year-old guy that I call myself a dinosaur dad because I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And I often tell the story of my son from last year who's 6, and I'd say, Alex, it's time to make your bed. And he'd say, Dad, I don't feel like it. I don't want to. Alex, I didn't ask you how you felt or what you want to do. It's time to make your bed. And of course, he's digging his heels in. I said, Alex, I'll give you $1 if you can count to 10 before I can make your bed. Now I've got his interest because he wants the $1. I said, but you got to count 1001, 1002. And so he starts to count, and he's got a single bed, and it takes me about 6 seconds to make it even really well, right? Pull the covers up, tuck him in, get the pillow right. And he doesn't get his $1, but he's learned an important lesson about how long some tasks take. And it's not the magic bullet because he can still dig his heels in. So I had to remind him of how long does that really take? Oh, it takes you 6 seconds, but it takes me longer. Okay, let me time how long it takes you. And he still realizes how long it takes. And now every day his bed is made. Now, are there rewards involved? His allowance is contingent upon him doing some of the household duties, one of which is making his bed. But part of my real education with Alex was teaching him how many things don't take long at all. And yet these are often the things that we procrastinate on that really build up, like picking up your stuff or making your bed or flossing your teeth or doing some of the other health habits that are important to us. So we need to model that in so many ways in terms of how long it takes to do it versus how long it takes to avoid it. Now this is not easy because I have a daughter who's 9 and she has a diagnosed learning disability and a little bit of attention. She has an inattention issue. She wasn't formally diagnosed with ADHD, but I'm a psychologist. I sat with a psychologist and I said, I think she's got an inattention problem. And my wife has finally agreed that now that she's learned more about ADHD and inattentive type, she's saying, that's Laurel, isn't it? I said, absolutely, it's Laurel. And Laurel fights so much about doing her homework. It can create the most unpleasant evenings for us because homework is just like a prison for all of us throughout their school years. And what we have to do is prime that pump of getting her to feel competent because, she's overwhelmed by doing the work. She's already imagining the worst, which we all do. The task always looms uglier and bigger before we get into it. Most of her stuff's in complete disarray, which is one of the toughest parts. She has very bad organizational skills. And so most of our bootstrapping and priming is helping her get organized, helping her get on task. And then once she's on task, wow, it's just incredible what she can do. But boy, she's ferocious. I mean, just truly ferocious during that whole process. So I have to use a lot of my own self-regulation skills not to react emotionally to her and just keep seeing her own fears and the reason and why she's pushing back, as opposed to just seeing this belligerent little person who should do what she's told. Mm-hmm. And that's the toughest part as a parent, is because, a lot of us were brought up as, who would ever talk like that? I would have been smacked across the back of the head. You just did what you were told. But here we're raising children to understand that that's not how people interact, and that she's going to do this for herself. And I also believe a lot of non-catastrophic failure. So I try not to be the helicopter parent and let her fail sometimes, so she has to face up to her teacher and say she didn't do the work. So all of those together are practical strategies that have a basis in developmental psychology. They do involve some reward, but reward is a slippery slope, and I think that's why you put it in the question. Because, if you set up rewards, then children will want a reward for everything. So if you're going to move to that kind of reward structure, you want to remember what Skinner showed us in the 50s and 60s, which is that the most powerful rewards was the variable ratio reward. You didn't get rewarded every time. The animal or the person would get rewarded occasionally, so that you see a pattern of working towards a reward that didn't depend on every performance got rewarded. And that's an art form in itself, how to negotiate that. So rewards, external rewards, can be helpful at the beginning, but you've got to move it back to a variable ratio, and then ultimately you want the young person to internalize these things. And more than that, as I want with my own daughter, I want her to see that she has the strategies internally to control herself when she's getting overwhelmed, and she is overwhelmed, to find ways to control herself. And at the risk of making this a very long answer, sometimes that involves breathing. Like with my daughter, who's intensely emotional, she's like me, like we're both what personality psychologists would say, very high on neuroticism or emotional instability. We're not the calmest of people, and she reacts so strongly, and so the two of us together, holy mackerel, can become if I don't work hard at it, become explosive. But I have to have her breathe. Literally, it's a volitional skill. I'll say, okay, Laurel, let's breathe deeply through our nose and exhale. And if you can do 10 of those with me, I think we'll be in a different place. And that's a volitional skill that many of us need to learn in our lives, because after you can do 10 nice deep breaths, your perception can change. And so I'm trying to teach my daughter self-regulatory skills, even at the level of how to calm yourself down. Now, nothing comes overnight, and nothing comes over even a week or two. It takes consistent belief in that these things will make a difference, as long as I keep as my goal self-regulation as opposed to conformance. If she's just conforming to my pressure, she's going to get to university and come apart at the seams, and I see it all the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lot. You're getting a lot of answers. You can cut me off if you want.
No, there's a quick question. I wanted to get a few more quick questions in. Digital apps, are there any that would help manage procrastination? Have you come across anything?
I haven't. I've looked at quite a few of them. I think we're all looking for that magic bullet. I use my digital appliances all the time. I have iPad, iPhone, and a Mac. I've been using a Mac since '85, so I'm in that cult deeply. All the other devices work the same way, of course. I'm a big user of a calendar. I color code all of my activities in a day. Professionally, that's teaching, research, and administration, but I color code my recreational time. I color code time with the kids, things that are specific to my wife. And one of the reasons for that is I can just glance at my week and do a forensic audit of where I'm spending my time and asking myself, am I spending my time where I want to be spending my time? Because remember, this is about living the life I want to live. But also, and more importantly, the reason I use a calendar is that if I agree to do something, much as I agreed to do this today, I put it in my calendar. And then I hold that as an intention that I have to live up to. Now, always recognizing that when the time comes, it doesn't mean I'm going to feel like it. Now, it's different with an obligation like I have today because it's so public, of course. But I treat all my obligations to myself like I treat my obligation to you, Wayne, which is I've made an intention. And so I just get started. So I find a calendar tool very powerful that way. Now, interestingly, what can happen with calendars and lists, like apps like Things and others that I've used, and I like Things, but we can use calendars and lists as an emotional coping device. So we make the list and we feel like we got things under control. And ironically, we put on the list things we've already done to cross those off. And we got our calendar set out, but I can tell you that most of us don't have anything listed for today that's mission critical. It starts tomorrow. So we got to watch how we use our calendar. And I use my calendar as a way to structure my life so I achieve the things that I want to achieve. Other apps, some geo apps that know your geolocation can be helpful for you if you really love technology, because they can help you with those reminders. But there's always the fear of second order procrastination where you don't even use the app. Yeah, that's a problem too.
Yeah. This is a good one. I don't think you directly answered this one, but this is very ADHD-ish. I can understand that emotions are key in why we procrastinate. But what's especially challenging for us ADDers is the executive functioning deficit, which doesn't seem to be I don't want to, but rather I don't know how to question. Can you provide any insight on this? And I know we've done a few stories where sometimes ADDers just don't want to ask questions because they don't want to look less than perfect. But in a case of procrastination, it can really hurt you unless you get that critical information somehow.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think you come back to the main point I wanted to make at the beginning, which was I don't think all the delay that we see associated with ADHD or ADD is procrastination at all. I agree. It's not emotion coping. It's like I'm just completely overwhelmed and confused. I don't know what to do next. It's just a big muddle. I keep forgetting. In fact, if you read the blog posts that I've written about ADHD, I talk about the first time I ran into a friend who was diagnosed with adult ADHD, and he felt such relief in understanding why he was, as he put it, such a screw-up all the time. Because he wasn't voluntarily putting off a task because he was coping with his emotions. He was just completely befuddled. And I think that seeking help is crucial, and using a lot of structure is crucial. And I think that as a community, you know more about this than I do. And that's why I wanted to take that off the table and say, I think we have to stop beating ourselves up with the word procrastination. I even think some of the researchers that use the term in relation to ADHD are just wrong. It's associated with needless delay, yes, but that needless delay is not the same roots as procrastination. It gets blurry when, of course, there's going to be people that have ADHD who also use procrastination as a coping mechanism. But for this last question, I tend to agree with you completely that it's going to be seeking out help, which, Wayne, you're right, many people don't want to. I work with students with special needs at the university, and I have to be very consciously aware of it. It's hard to ask. I can go back to my daughter as another perfect example. She hates to be centered out in her class for her learning disability or confusion and her inability to read as well as her friends because she feels stupid. And yet that just leads to her coming home and not being able to do her homework. And then what does she do at home? Then she acts out emotionally because it's all just coming out of her pores. She's frustrated. She hates having the characteristics she has as an individual, the challenges she's facing. And so that's where not only is it self-compassion, but then on my part, it's other compassion. Compassion's huge there. And structure is, yeah. So I hope together that made some sense. But I certainly live that at many levels, professionally and personally.
I don't know if you can answer this in a short form, but it doesn't have to be that short. But loads of questions about people who consider themselves perfectionists, and they want to lose that tendency, or at least mute it to the point where, well, to prevent them from procrastinating. A lot of them pinpoint perfectionism as a reason why they procrastinate. They don't think they're capable of doing the job perfectly. So is there any worldview or studies on that, about how to lose that or mute it or put it more in the background?
I'd recommend, because we're getting close to the end of our hour, that people that are interested in this look up the work of Gordon Flett, F-L-E-T-T, at York University. I have posted a few things on my blog, and I've interviewed Gordon in my own podcast, I Procrastinate podcast. It's a few years ago I interviewed him on this. That might give the long answer for those who want it. But as I said before, there's more than one flavor of perfectionism. I'm quite sure these are all socially prescribed perfectionists that they're trying to live up to the unreasonable expectation of others. They've internalized this, and there's almost never any satisfaction with the work done. That's one of the telling signs that you do it, but it's never good enough. And I think honestly, a counseling relationship can be very important there, because these are long ingrained patterns of thinking about and of self-worth and feelings about self. And the short answer to it is, the perfect is the enemy of the good enough. And that's why a lot of us just can't use the next 10 minutes and get something done, because you think, well, I can't do that perfectly in the next 10 minutes. Who's asked you to do it perfectly? Almost no one ever does. In fact, you're the person pushing that on yourself. Just get something done, and you'd be surprised how much you can give back to the world without anybody criticizing you, even though in your heart of heart you're still thinking, it could have been better. Yeah, it might have been better, but it's good enough, and that's all that we really need. And that's the short answer to it. But the long answer, take a look at Gordon Flett's work.
Well, that was a great answer. That really was. That hit home for me. So
it hits home to me too.
We'll have to end it there. Thanks, Dr. Pychyl, for all of your insights and takeaways. It was very instructive for me.
Yeah, thanks for coming today, and I hope it did make a difference. And, the answer lies between you and me. I didn't come here with all the answers, because we're far from... we don't understand ADHD completely. We certainly don't understand procrastination completely yet. I think that we're walking towards that together.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Dr. Pychyl, again, and have a good day, everyone.
Yep, take care.
Mm-hmm.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.